Well, first of all, how are you guys doing today?
Great. It's the 6th de Mayo, so there were some margaritas consumed last night, which I hope does not interfere with my brain function today.
Well, I think it would only be fitting, actually, based on today's topic.
Right.
So one of the things I wanted to mention is that last week we had the opportunity to record a podcast about Patrick's experience seeing Randy Rhoads and Ozzy Osbourne live in August of 1981. And that has engendered some really interesting feedback from people who watched the video. Patrick, thank you for sharing some of those stories and pictures from your friends who also attended the show.
Oh, you're welcome. Then several of my friends chimed in with their experiences because, that was, we all went to the same concerts from high school. So, people, of course, you saw the extra pictures and comments that I sent your way. Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, and what blew me away was, what made this very unique was that front row experience that you had of seeing Randy Rhoads, like 2 feet in front of you. And then to have some pictures surface from your friends. Were you able to, at that time, like sneak a camera into the venue? He was very strict from what I remember with bringing cameras in or was that something from like a local newspaper? Because I couldn't find any pictures.
No, that was just someone who had snuck a camera in. Again, I don't remember what the photo rules were at that time, but if you look at the pictures that I sent you guys, and maybe then we can cover this in another follow-up episode or something, they looked like they were kind of taken, from somebody who was trying to hide the camera. They were a little blurry and sort of not really well centered. Well,
Patrick, really quickly, I'm just going to show everybody this one picture that fascinated me. I'll put it up on the screen so you guys can see it as well. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about this, because this is a picture of your friend with Randy Rhoads that I'd never seen before. Here it is.
Okay, this is my brother's friend. My brother sent this to me. And I don't know that much about the picture other than it is from that show. And this guy was able to, I guess, meet him either backstage or there was a stage door that we used to try to meet people at right outside in the back, which was another cool thing about this venue. You could kind of hang out out back if you knew where this stage door was. And I think that's what this may be, or it might be the dressing room or something, but
yeah, it was an amazing picture in the sense that I don't believe most people have ever seen it before. And then also your other friends sent us a concert photo, which and they were generous enough to allow us to use it as the thumbnail for that podcast, which was incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty cool that some photos actually surfaced from that.
Way before the days of paid meet and greets. So
right. Oh yeah, no, this is right. You're
yeah. $5,000 to
gorilla meet
photo with Ozzy Osbourne in 2020. So that's pretty awesome. A free Randy Rhoads photo and meet and greet.
Right.
The old-fashioned way, just hanging out by the tour bus.
Yeah, and we did learn that he was playing the white Les Paul.
We did learn that. And another interesting piece of trivia that was revealed through conversations and people sharing memories is the fact that on that particular night, they did not play Crazy Train.
That was right. That was something we all remember too. That he didn't do an encore. He didn't do Crazy Train.
Which adds credence to this notion that, there was drama in the air and they were looking to cut that show short in terms of duration. As soon as they could get off stage, they played 8 songs as opposed to 12 or whatever the normal set list was.
Right, and we did find the set list too, right?
Yeah, I looked it up before the show, and I forgot to even mention it when we were filming. I was like, for a headlining set, this seems very short. There was something unusual. And then everything unusual was discussed in the podcast. So it all makes sense that they wanted to get right out of town as fast as possible, cut their losses, and move on to Fort Wayne. So pretty cool little piece of history.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to mention, just because a few people have asked, the question has come up, how do we all know each other? And that's a long conversation. But for the purpose of today, I'll just share this photo, which is a picture of the first Fuzz Box album. And this is a record that Shane, Patrick, Giovanni, and I recorded during the 90s in New York City.
Look at those guys.
Look at those guys. This is available on all streaming services if anyone's interested in checking it out. But we have a long history of performing together and being friends. So today's conversation, yeah, absolutely. Today's conversation actually precedes Fuzz Box and takes us back to the 80s. For those who don't know, there's a recording studio. It's located on 441 West 53rd Street in the Hell's Kitchen section of Manhattan. And it's called the Power Station. The reason it was called the Power, or is called the Power Station, is because it was a consolidated Edison power station until 1977, when Tony Bongiovi and his partner, whose name was Bob Walters.
That's right, Bob Walters, yeah.
Yeah. Remodeled this building and turned it into a first-class recording studio. And as they say, the rest is history. During the 80s, so many hit records were recorded at the Power Station. It has this incredible history. And Patrick had the amazing opportunity to live there, to be part of it, to witness all of these recording sessions, and obviously to record there himself as part of the band French Lick. So most people, when they hear about the Power Station, they think about Bon Jovi. Obviously, there's the connection between Tony Bongiovi and Jon Bon Jovi. Patrick, how are they related?
They are cousins. They are cousins.
And my understanding is that Jon Bon Jovi, After Hours, recorded his first single, Runaway, at the Power Station. So this probably would have been in 1983, early 84.
Probably maybe even a little earlier than that, like right around that time. I mean, I think that's when his record came out.
Okay.
Yeah, as far, so, I just want to say I'm no Power Station expert or guru or oracle on any of these things. I can only relay what my experiences were.
But you did live there, so
I did live there, so I probably have a little bit more of an insight. They were cousins, and John wanted to be a rock star, and his cousin Tony had the studio, and I think John's mom said, "Hey, can you do something for John? He's interested in music," and so Tony let him come hang out at Power Station, and just did everything he could to help him be a rock star. He helped him, gave him studio time. And, and I guess depending on whose story you believe, John says he worked at the studio sweeping floors and everything. Mm-hmm. Tony swears up and down John never picked up a broom, So they have a little bit of a contentious, I don't know if they do anymore, but they had a very contentious falling out.
But it's something I actually wanted to say right off the bat was because I'm a Bon Jovi fan, and I remember hearing, even in the rock magazines, that he got his start sweeping floors at the Power Station in exchange for studio time in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I think that makes a better story than it does the reality. Having lived that scenario,
of course,
I pretty much lived John's scenario, except he lived in New Jersey, so he could go home at night. I lived at the studio, and probably he did for the most part, they would give him studio in the off hours, the off time when, you know, because the rest of the time they're booking the studio to make money. So he would give him
and even by the time Bon Jovi was there doing his demos or his first record or whatever, I mean, this place was legendary because I think it opened up in '77, and you had already had like Lennon and McCartney and all these A-list records and things being done at the studio. So it was a pretty awesome opportunity for Jon himself to be able to record in such a facility.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you know, for these things to happen, everything has to line up just right. And the stars lined up for him perfectly, you know. He had the connections. He had his cousin with the studio. He was motivated. He had, you know, he was a rock star. He looked great, had rock star attitude.
Mm-hmm. And just to let the listeners know, Tony Bongiovi's credit list as a producer and engineer is really amazing. I did a little research, and I'll just list a few of the many to give you an appreciation for his credits, which included going all the way back to the 70s, hit songs by Gloria Gaynor, such as Never Say Goodbye. Gloria Gaynor is, you know, of the I Will Survive fame, that, you know, classic, iconic disco hit. He produced Jimi Hendrix albums, the Ramones. You might remember from the 70s, Miko, I believe is how you pronounce it, the you know, Star Wars funk hit from 1977. Right. The Talking Heads, Ace Frehley's solo record in 1978. Rockin' a Hard Place by Aerosmith in 1982. Bark at the Moon by Ozzy Osbourne in 1983. The Bon Jovi album that came out in 1984. And the last credit that I could see was the Goo Goo Dolls in 2002. So a very expansive credit list.
Well, I can kind of comment on a couple of those. The Ace Frehley, that's incorrect. He didn't produce his solo record. He produced when Ace broke away from Kiss. He was hired to produce Ace's demos to try to get him signed to a major deal. So Ace had no record deal after Kiss, and he was trying to do his solo thing. So that's when, and I had just arrived as that was happening.
Now let me ask you,
Ace Frehley was actually like the first rock star I ever met.
In what year was this? Was this maybe 84, 85?
No, this was 85. So our last podcast, we were in the August of 81. Now we're in August of 85.
Okay. So senior high school to just a couple of years later, man, I mean, that's quite an amazing jump in terms of, you know, you're just a fan in the front row with Randy Rhoads. Now you're, you know, rubbing elbows. And in this studio where, like, think about this. The Bruce Springsteen, Born in the USA, and those iconic Madonna albums were recorded there. So you're coming in as those albums are dominating, you know, the charts. So now I almost understand why Jon Bon Jovi, that is recording there in the overnight hours. I mean, you're talking A-list, you know, #1 albums being pumped out of this place during the day.
It's the place to be at that time, you know, for the music industry, making records.
Which leads us.
And I just wanted to add one more thing, because we were talking about Ozzy. So, but you know, Tony had a reputation for as a mix engineer also. So if, you know, record companies would bring him records, they didn't quite like the mix or it needed something, you know, they'd ask him to fix it, you know, which he did with several records. Ozzy Osbourne, Bark at the Moon was one of them. He did it, the Scorpions, he mixed Rock You Like a Hurricane. So, you know, they would bring him these things and say, hey, you know, we don't like the way this mixes. Can you remix this song, make it a hit?
In addition to his talents as remixing and tweaking the audio. And that's what I wanted to ask you. You know, the equipment at this place, at least I mean, I know other recordings, if they're bringing in tapes that were recorded elsewhere, but that live room that I saw online, and I've never been there, I'm just seeing it is one of the most incredible looking live rooms I've ever seen in my life. So from a technological standpoint, you know, in addition to his talent, the equipment must have been just top notch for the time, right? If he's, you know, getting these tracks to tweak and
Well, yes and no. I mean, a lot of it was vintage gear that he knew, excuse me, because he started out as an engineer at Motown. And from the story he tells, he got a job at Motown as a teenager by writing them a letter saying, hey, I know how you get your vocal sound. Here's how you do it, blah, blah, blah. And then he was invited to work for them. So in building Power Station, the way he tells it is, you know, him and his partner, Bob Walters was a studio manager. He ran this place, Sigma Sound. So he was kind of the business head. And then Tony was the brains behind the technology. Mm. So they found this space, this building, they bought the building, and he knew he had to build this studio as cheaply as possible. So the materials he chose were just based on what he knew would work. It was just like pine board, burlap, and insulation. And then he designed the room so that there would be no reflections anywhere, you know, a properly designed acoustic space. Mm. And he just hit the jackpot with it. You know, it just had that perfect sound. It had the vibe. It was completely different in a way, you know, it had a different look, a different feel. But he really, you know, emphasized that he did it on the cheap. Mm. You know, and the gear he used was a lot of that vintage stuff that he had learned at Motown. You know, it was full of these Pultec equalizers. Every room had racks of these tube equalizers, which sort of brought that craze to the front, and the Neve console. So it was, and it was, and then, you know, younger engineers started coming in, and there was a very rigorous training program there that you had to go through. So those guys would bring in all this cutting edge stuff and sort of break the rules with their recording techniques and mixing. You had guys like Jason Corsaro and Bob, his name, I'm having a mental block, but he did like Bryan Adams and Bruce Springsteen, Bob Clearmountain. Mm. And amongst other really talented engineers. So it kind of became this like a hotspot of talent and technology.
And to jump back a little bit, Pat, can you get into your history a little bit, how you evolved from the last podcast in terms of attending this Ozzy concert to finding yourself living at the Power Station in such a short time frame?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess that's just more of, you know, my personal dream story was, you know, I wanted to be a rock star. I knew I wanted to be a rock star. Didn't know how I was going to get there, but I was in college, and I had this band called the Lynx Band, and we used to play every Sunday, not every Sunday, but on Sunday nights, occasionally we would play at this place called the Triangle in Greenville, Ohio. Now, the interesting thing about this place was that you couldn't, in those days on Sunday nights, you couldn't drink alcohol in Indiana, right? You know? So, but Ohio, you could drink. So there was this guy had turned a barn into a nightclub. So it was a huge barn, and they would have live bands there every Sunday. And so we used to play there regularly. And one of the guys who I ended up coming out here to New York with just happened to be driving by one night on a Sunday and decided to stop in there. And I was singing. And he saw me singing and said, you know, came up to me on one of our breaks and said, hey, my buddies and I are doing this project. You know, would you be into doing some studio recording? And I said, oh, yeah, sure. But, you know, I didn't really take it that seriously because at that time we had been, you know, I was kind of already at that age, 21 or whatever, I'd already been playing the Indiana dive bar scene for a couple of years. So I was used to these drunk people coming up to me like, oh, man, you guys are great. You ought to, you know, you need to do this or that, or, you know, my buddy's got this and that. So I would just say, yeah, you know, try to be friendly to everybody. And he says, okay, fine. Next, let me know when you guys are playing here again, and I'll bring my buddies, and we'll talk to you. So, I mean, this is kind of an extensive story of how I got from, you know, point A to point B, but which we maybe can cover in another more extended version. But I had, long story short, I hooked up with these guys who had the connection with Tony Bongiovi, and they invited me to come to New York with them.
I see.
You know, so from high school, I had kept playing, you know, I had bands in high school, got into college, and just sort of became a grizzled, you know, whatever my young age was, dive bar veteran.
But your story lends credence to this notion that for anybody who's aspiring to have a career in music, you have to be out there and be playing so that there's visibility, and you just never know who's going to hear you. And right. You know, that one random time someone hears you sing, and it just forms this nexus, and you know, to where, you know, a year later you're living at the power station or whatever it was. Yeah,
I think, you know, really, I think it's like any ambition you have or any dream. You have to work hard. You have to be open to possibilities. You know, put yourself in the right place. Take some chances. You know, try to know when you've got an opportunity looking at you.
Sure, and although you were at the right place at the right time.
Matt Wells was his name, and I could have said, yeah, you know, I'm not really that interested, whatever.
So the person who approached you was Matt Wells?
Right, Matt Wells was.
I see, which is how you two met.
Exactly, that's how we met.
Yeah. Ah, okay.
And then he brought two other guys, Ken Anderson and Ken Thomas and Michael Anderson.
And that was the formation of French Lick, or at least
that was the chrysalis of French Lick.
I see.
Right. So they wanted, you know, and Mike Anderson was the other singer. He had a kind of a different voice than I did. He had more of like a Steve Perry Journey voice. And then I had this kind of rock and roll, you know, AC/DC, Def Leppard, Bon Jovi-ish kind of voice. So they were trying to cover all the bases, you know, and they saw me that, I guess, you know, I made a good front man, so.
Yeah, one thing that I will link in this video, just so people can see, is there's a really awesome video of French Lick performing at this Battle of the Bands that was televised on national TV during the early 90s, 1990.
I think that was New Year's Eve, 1990 or 1991. I can't, you know, I'd have to go back and look at the exact year.
We'll link it in the video so people can see Patrick during.
Yikes.
And one note with that particular show at the time, I know that that video features Brian Tichy on drums, who has played with everyone from Ozzy to Whitesnake to Billy Idol. He's probably one of the most sought after drummers in modern history here, probably in the last 30 years. So watching that video a couple of months ago for the first time in several years, I was like, wow, holy crap, that's Brian Tichy on the drums. And I also know that Anthony Esposito was in your band for a while as well, and he went on to play with Lynch Mob, who I love too. Lynch Mob is George Lynch from Dawkins' post-Dawkins band.
Right.
And then Anthony went on to play with Ace Frehley. So there's all these kind of weird, you know, connections that all lead back to each other. But I know some of these guys in French Lick, you know, went on to do some pretty cool stuff.
Well, pretty much everyone who was in French Lick became famous except for us. If you wanted to be famous, join French Lick. Yeah, no, I guess, you know, and our drummers, we were sort of like Spinal Tap, you know, we had to, but really we were a studio band, you know, it wasn't a band. We formed as this project to write hit songs and, you know, become a rock stars. So it wasn't like we formed as a live band. We sort of formed in the studio and then had to put together a live band. So once we actually had to go out and start playing, we had a bunch of different people.
I just wanted to interject a quick
in and out of the fold as we progressed along our journey. And for that show, you know, Brian was available and we asked him to do it. And he came out to LA with us. And Sean Farrell was playing bass.
That's awesome.
In that show, yeah.
I just wanted to mention, in case anybody wonders about this, I used to wonder about it. The first time I had the chance to tour the Midwest, which was 20 years ago, back in 2000, we're driving through Indiana and along a freeway, and I see a road sign that says French Lick. And that was a eureka moment where everything came together. And I think I sent you or called you. I said, Patrick, I finally understand where you're coming from.
You're
French
right.
Lick,
You have
Indiana.
to be there to know. Well, yeah, and you know the name, we chose the name French Lick. Like I said, we were just sort of a studio band. Now we had to get a name, an image, a live show together, and we thought, well, French Lick, that's kind of edgy. It's actually, we're from Indiana, and at Power Station, you know, since we never really had a band name, all the people that worked there used to call us the Indiana Crew. So, you know, when they book us in to do our studio sessions, just like John, you know, we'd get the off hours or whoever was available, or we could, you know, ask for a certain time. If we had an important project, they might book us in sooner or whatever.
And were you living there almost as being a service, not only as a band or a studio band, but I think you had mentioned earlier possibly writing for other artists, being, you know, on call or at disposal to work with any artist? Was that part of the motivation of having Tony having you live there?
Yeah, well, that was part of trying to get us to the next level. I think Tony was trying anything he could to get us through the door. You know, to get a foot in the door, you know, because if you can become known as a songwriter or, you know, produce something for another artist, if anybody could have any, you know, his attitude was, if we can have any success with anything, that becomes your resume. Then, you know, you could say, hey, I got these guys, they wrote a song for this movie and that movie, and they were working with, you know, Ace Frehley and Phoebe Snow or whoever he had. So, you know, his motivations for that were good at that point.
I think a lot of people who are watching this video are I'm going to assume are big Bon Jovi or Kiss fans, just based on our viewership. So can you share any stories about what it was like hanging out, writing, jamming with Ace Frehley? I remember you telling me one time about you and Ace playing Cold Gin together. Well,
I mean, as you can imagine, so you guys being big Kiss fans, and that's what really got me into music, you know, was, you know, once I heard Kiss Alive, I was like, whoa, all right, this is for me. Yeah, that was our first week in New York was a pretty interesting one, because Tony had just started working with Ace Frehley, producing his, trying to get him signed to a major record deal. So he was trying to find, you know, like 3 hit songs for him that he could take to the label and say, here's what we got, you know, now sign him and I'll produce it and whatever. So my first week there, Tony says, you know, I'm working with Ace Frehley. I want you guys to write. Or, you know, he tells Ace, I got these guys from Indiana. They're really talented. I want you to write songs with them. So Ace, all right. Now, the other guys in the band weren't the guys in French Lick, Indiana Crew, AKA French Lick, whatever you want to call us at that time. They weren't such big Kiss fans. So they're like, okay, yeah, Patrick, you can write with him. So, and of course I'm like, you know, pick me. I want to do it. So, you know, Ace Frehley comes over. Tony had the top floor of the Power Station. That the studio was on the 3 floors below. There was 3 studios and a parking garage. and a basement where they had live chambers and stuff. But he lived in the building. His apartment was on the entire 4th floor. And, you know, it was pretty modest. You know, nothing fancy, but enough room. It had 2 bedrooms. And then Tony's had his big suite in the back. And we were all crammed in it. We made one room a demo studio. And then the other, with the 4 of us, slept in one bedroom, which is pretty funny. Try doing that for 4 years, even with your best buddies, you know.
And I think it's
but that first week, he says, you know, Ace, I want you to write with these guys. So, you know, I find myself in Tony's living room. There's me and Ace Frehley sitting down to write songs together, you know, and I knew that Cold Gin was one of his songs that he had written, right? And so I start playing Cold Gin. And he's like, no, it's like this, you know, and he's like showing me how to play it. So I was in Kiss heaven, as you can imagine. And then I sort of, you know, from there on, I became friends with Ace during that time. So that was really super cool.
Incredible.
And he was totally sober at that point. He was not drinking.
At that point, so we're talking in the vicinity of August 1985. So presumably he's recording demos for what would eventually become the Frehley's Comet record in 1987.
Right. Well, eventually, so yeah, we tried writing songs for him. We wrote with him. I actually have a cassette somewhere in here. It's Ace Frehley gave to me with, you know, 3 of his song ideas. Said, here, you know, here, see what you can do with these. We listened to, you know, Tony had all these other songwriters that he was trying to bring in to get Ace Frehley a hit song, you know, that he could take to the label. So we went through all these tapes. You know, Tony had us listening, here, listen to these tapes and tell me if any of these are good. And but eventually he was not able to get him signed, and they, you know, went their separate ways amicably.
And Patrick, you raise an important point, something that I find really interesting and fascinating. And I think a lot of young musicians maybe fail to appreciate this, which is that just because you're a rock star, or just because you, you know, you have professional experience behind you, the music business is predicated in hit songs or in songwriting. I mean, that is the core, the ability to, you know, produce songs that, you know, have commercial appeal. So it's interesting to note that, you know, you have this rock icon, Ace Frehley, but even Ace, you know, needs hit songs. So behind the scenes.
That's right. I mean, and, you know, that was a different time too. Record companies were prone to giving the individual members of bands, you know, you saw it all the time, guys that go. That was why when they would sign bands in those days, they always had an option for the individual members. You know, because you never knew who was going to break out and have a hit after that. But I think Ace, you know, he had gotten himself kicked out of Kiss, and, you know, was known to be a drinker or whatever. So I think he kind of had a reputation also to deal with. But definitely, just because you're a big star, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get signed to a record deal or anything. You still have to prove yourself, you know, because at the end of the day, it is about money. They want to see you selling records, and they want to see that you have your act together. So for instance, like even with Ozzy, you know, even though the guy was a mess, at least, you know, Sharon was taking care of him, and he was able to do his show and promote his brand and sell records. So there is that whole commercial side that you have to reconcile with the artistic side, you know?
Yeah, and there was this, back to Ace Frehley, there was a little bit of a, you know, a black cloud over him in terms of his reputation, because I happened to just finish Johnny Z's book. Johnny Z he founded Megaforce Records, who ultimately Ace signed with.
Right, ultimately.
Johnny Z also is responsible for discovering Metallica. That's what he's best known for, but he just recently put out a book called Heavy Tales, which is great. But Johnny wasn't a huge Kiss fan, but his A&R guy at the time was Eddie Trunk, who's a pretty well-known radio personality now,
Right.
you know, was really saying, hey, Johnny, give him a second chance. He's cleaned up his act. But it had a reputation, and Johnny initially just didn't want to touch him. I don't know if I want anything to do with that guy. He's a little bit, you know, wild and reckless, and maybe it's not such a great idea. But ultimately, Megaforce signed them, and they were distributed by Atlantic Records, and the album, you know, did okay. I think it maybe just about went gold, the first Frehley's Comet album.
Right. Interestingly, and I wish I could find those, Tony did produce this 3-song tape that they were shopping around the label, and it's really good. I thought it was great. You know, songs are great. They're a little fluffier than you might expect from Ace Frehley, but Tony was interested in producing hits. So, you know, they have a little bit of a pop flavor to them, but they're really good. They've got that power station sound. Ace sounds great. So I don't know why he didn't get a deal with that stuff. I don't know what was going on there, but definitely the record that he ended up making with Megaforce was nowhere near as good, I thought, as the stuff that Tony had produced for him.
Right, because
Tony, you know, made sure he had the best engineers. Anton Fig was playing drums. He had, you know, Tony oversaw all the mixing and everything. So
with the Kiss hardcores, it's pretty well known that pre-Frehley's Comet demo sessions, and I don't know if you know who like Richie Scarlett is.
Yeah, he was.
If I pronounce his name right. He went on to play with Ace Frehley quite a, like post Frehley's Comet, but he was part of the original you know, band that Ace had put together, and I was wondering if he was part of those particular demos. But Ace was out doing some shows prior to launching Frehley's Comet. So it was a really kind of cool time. And there's always been rumors of these demos and these songs that he did prior to the Frehley's Comet album that were supposed to be really, really good. So to hear that firsthand, I've never heard them, and I don't think they're online or on YouTube or anywhere. It's kind of Kiss folklore
Right.
about that.
Well, I mean, I'm sure I'm not at liberty to, you know, broadcast anything publicly, but I could play for you privately, you know, the stuff. I'll find it. I do have tapes of it. So, yeah, it's really good. It's actually better than I think a lot of the stuff he ended up releasing.
And being
Sean.
that we're on Kiss for a second, I want to bring up as well, in addition to this time period, you linking up and kind of writing and working with Ace, do I remember correctly that Paul Stanley was interested in managing your band?
Well, that was later. Yeah. So yeah, also interesting how there's this whole Kiss tie-in. So there was Ace Frehley on the front end, and then later, near the end of our tenure there, we were, you know, we've been there like 4 years. We haven't had a record deal. Tony's plan had sort of shifted to, you know, he was still trying to get us a major deal, but now he was thinking more like, well, you know what? I could just have my own label like Motown, and these guys can be the first act on my label. So he was really pushing to try to get us on his own label.
But that's a commitment, man, in terms of like, you know, you could say this, I mean, 4 years or 3 years or whatever it was. I mean, he believed in you, you know, and true. I'm not just saying this to kiss up to you. You've been a friend for a long time. You're, besides Paul Stanley, my favorite singer of all time. I'm a huge fan. So, but there was something there, obviously. Something very, very special. And I mean, I know that. But for the viewers to know, that's commitment in terms of like hanging around 3 or 4 years trying to make this.
It was definitely a marriage, like a 4-year marriage there with a lot of ups and downs. But getting back to Paul Stanley, so near the end of our tenure there, you know, Tony was kind of, you know, we didn't have a major deal yet. The natives are restless. We're like, you know, WTF, dude, you know, it's 4 years. You're supposed to get us a major deal. And now he's kind of focusing on trying to have his own label. And So we sort of took to the streets ourselves and started giving these tapes out. And up until then, it was mostly him shopping the tape to whoever he said. And then we kind of revolted and started just giving the tapes out. Like, we need a deal, you know? And our contract with him was expiring. So we're like, you know, we're just going to go do this ourselves. So we took the tapes and started giving them out. And I think Matt's girlfriend had a connection to Paul Stanley. One of these tapes landed. Oh, Paul Stanley was rehearsing. He was producing another band that was rehearsing where we were rehearsing on 28th Street, which became Tin Pan Alley. At that time, it was called Stickwork, but it was the Tin Pan Alley. So Paul Stanley was rehearsing there with another band, and I think the owner gave him our tape. And he heard the tape and said, I want to meet these guys. So at that point, we got a meeting with Paul Stanley in the KISS offices, like on 7th Avenue in New York, which was another big thrill.
Oh, sure.
You know, being privately ushered into Paul Stanley's private office, you know, with all his KISS records on the wall. And I remember he had a big jar of candy on his desk. He's like, oh, you know, here, have some if you want. And as we were leaving, we didn't see Gene Simmons or anybody else, but Eric Carr was there. So we met him on the way out. But yeah, we had this, you know, closed office meeting with Paul Stanley where he said, oh, well, you know, I think you guys are great. What do you want to do? What's your dream? You know, what's going on? So we told him our whole story and everything. And he said, well, I'll just, you know, be straight up with you guys. I want to work with you guys. I want to produce the band, get you guys a record deal. He goes, but you have to decide what you want to do about Tony Bongiovi. Because he said, you know, we had a similar contract with a manager when we started out. And if we wouldn't have, if we weren't able to break away from that, we never would have made it. So he kind of gave us this dire
ultimatum,
right, forecast, which ended up being true. But it was just, you know, it was a big thrill to have.
That's incredible.
Paul Stanley wanting to produce your band, saying, I want to sign you guys. You know, and I think for most of that meeting, I was just so like, I'm sitting in Paul Stanley's office right now, even though at that point I had met a lot of stars. And so I was a little starstruck in that meeting.
But like we always said, it always goes back for all three of us, the KISS alive. And, you know, maybe you had checked out a little bit in terms of 80s KISS. And Darren and I hadn't, but, you know, that's where it all started. And you wouldn't have been in his office if it wasn't for him initially in that band. Certainly, I would have never picked up a guitar if it wasn't for KISS.
Here's another fascinating connection, which I guess proves that we were just destined to meet. Shane and I grew up in a small city in upstate New York, and the college there is they have a music industry program, and it's one of the first schools in America that ever established a music industry or music business program, and that was started by Janet Nepke. And in the late 80s, Shane and I were in a rock group called Vicious Angel, and, you know, locally speaking, we were very popular. And Janet sort of took us under her wings, and she, one afternoon, you know, I'm in her office, and similar to, you know, asking me, you know, well, what do you guys want to do? Anyway, she goes through her Rolodex and she calls up Tony Bongiovi, which was a huge deal. I mean, anybody who grew up in the late 80s can appreciate, you know, what an enormous star, you know, Bon Jovi was. So any nexus or connection to him was just epic.
Just the name.
So she called him, and, you know, they're having a conversation. I'm sitting in the office, and, you know, he, you know, took an interest based on her recommendation. And I just remember him saying, I'd love to help them. I'm in a bit of a situation right now. Let's, you know, keep in touch. In other words, the impression I got was—
That situation being that he was trying to clean up the mess with us.
Yeah.
That was going on at that time, the tail end of that. And I remember her because she came to the power station, you know, he referred to her as, you know, the teacher or whatever, but he did mention, you know, Janet Nepke, and that she, you know, had a band, and it ended up being your band. So that's just crazy that we randomly end up meeting and becoming bandmates, like, you know, 10 years later, 5 years later, whatever.
It was meant to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that whole connection too, talk about meant to be, the fact that we recorded, rehearsed, you know, after the Power Station at Tin Pan Alley, which was Stick's work, where Paul Stanley was producing the bands. But we basically lived there too, in terms of recording, rehearsing there all the time. And ultimately, that's where I met my wife. So talk about, you know, meant to be on a lot of different levels.
Right, it all ties in.
It's amazing. It really is. You hear the 6 degrees of separation, but I think in the music business, it's 1 or 2.
Yeah, a lot of times it's much less than 6.
Yeah, exactly. Quickly, Patrick, I remember you telling me another story about your time at the Power Station that involved Aldo Nova.
Right. So Aldo Nova, I don't know if anybody knows who he is. He's a Canadian artist, sort of another one of these 80s album-oriented rock artist, solo artist, really talented guy.
His big hit was Fantasy.
Right. Life is just a fantasy. Can you live this fantasy life? And, you know, when I listen to these, if you listen to that, so listen to that song and then listen to Bon Jovi, Runaway.
Yeah.
You'll hear all Tony's signature production tricks, you know, with same kind of vocal treatment. It's got, you know, some hook that's repeats itself. I know he edited it to do this little riff that was in there. It's got the keyboards that are going dun 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 dun.
Sure, that fusion of the electric guitar and the keyboards was a hallmark of the 80s pop metal sound, or pop rock. I mean, because it really was pop. I mean, you can call it hard rock or heavy metal, but the fact of the matter is that was radio in the mid 80s.
Yeah,
and that was also 13-year-old Darren Woolsey. Every song that he wrote had the keyboard, you know, 8 notes, heavily influenced by that style of production too. Talk about a tie-in. I mean, you should hear some of our earlier demos that are out. You know, stuff when we were super young, but it's all that.
I'd love to hear that.
Guilty as charged.
But yeah, but I realized that because the first time when we went in to record, the first song we went in the Power Station to record with Tony was, he was hired as a music consultant for this movie Youngblood, which ended up being a bomb, but it was Rob Lowe. You know, they were going to make this big, it was a hockey movie about a hockey player where Rob Lowe was the, you know, stud hockey player and the whole story behind that. But they needed a title track for this. So, and we had just gotten there. So we wrote this song, Youngblood. And when we went in to record it, you know, Tony said, oh yeah, it's a great song. But then he started adding, he said, okay, you need to put some keyboards like this. Tony wasn't a musician, so he could just, you know, try to explain it, hum it to you or tell you, you know, it needs motion. You got to always be moving forward. You know, it needs the keyboards and the background vocals. They should be saying, this and that, you know. He had this sort of, you had to sort of decipher what he was saying. But then I realized all those layers are on every record. That, you know, Runaway has those keyboards and the guitars chugging with that, and then power chords, and the drummer, you know, he was insistent that we use a certain drummer. I also learned, you know, the importance of having a solid drummer in the studio.
Oh, for sure.
And he wasn't even going to let us play the instruments. You know, he didn't know if we were, you know, he knew we were good songwriters, but he didn't know if we were good enough to play in the studio. So we had to prove that. You know?
That is reminiscent of, you know, the Wrecking Crew in LA, that whole story of where, you know, behind the scenes, behind these hit records, oftentimes, you know, who you saw on the album cover was not who performed the recording.
Because ultimately the record was the most important thing, you know. And I think probably for a lot of bands you would listen to now, that you would even think, you know, like Rolling Stones, look, even the Beatles had Billy Preston. You bring in these people that make the record great. But anyway, so I digress. We were talking about Aldo Nova.
Life is just a fantasy.
So Tony produced the first Aldo Nova song. Now, Aldo Nova went and gacked himself up on coke and drugs and, you know, had a little bit of a meltdown and lost his record deal. Now Aldo Nova needs to make his comeback. So he came back and said, you know, oh, Tony, would you, you know, Aldo had been living in Canada and he came to New York to visit. And so Tony said, yeah, you can stay here. And previous to this, I mean, Tony had told me all these crazy stories about him and Aldo Nova hanging out and doing debaucherous things.
It was the 80s.
Yeah, it was the 80s. So, you know, Tony lets Aldo come stay at Power Station for a few days while he's in town. And Aldo Nova befriended me. And so we went gallivanting around Manhattan for a couple of days. And this was when we were working on our French Lick stuff. This was probably around 1988 or something. We were working on songs that we had done at the Power Station.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a song we had called Right Before My Eyes that I was working on I told you we had a little demo studio in there. So I was working on the vocal or something, and Aldo heard the song. He goes, oh man, that's a effing great song. I could hear that all over the radio. Let me put a guitar solo on that. And we didn't have a guitar solo on it yet, you know. And Matt was cool about it. He's like, yeah, go ahead, let him play. You know, could only help. And so he put this killer, I just set him up with a little guitar amp. We actually, in this demo studio, we were able to use all this extra equipment at Power Station had. So we had a 24-track tape machine and a console and everything and all this great gear right up in the apartment. And so I just mic'd up this little one of Matt's homemade guitar amps. Aldo just grabbed a guitar and did a couple passes on this solo. And if you want to hear that song, you can go to my website, rockstarpmk.com. And if you look under French Lick, it's called Right Before My Eyes. And
wow.
he did a ripping solo on it. It was really cool. But he and I went hanging around Manhattan for a couple of days, which was interesting. You know, because he took me to the record companies where, you know, to Polygram, that was his old label. And, you know, we talked to people there.
And at the time, that was on the corner of 50th and 8th Avenue.
Right. I don't remember. All the record labels were kind of in the same area there. There was CBS, sort of in Midtown, the Midtown area.
Yeah.
And people that are not from New York, I mean, have to understand the 1988 Hell's Kitchen in that area is not the 2020 version of Disneyland. No. You know, I mean, it was rough and tough, and it was much before the transformation that New York City underwent in the 90s, where it was really cleaned up by Rudy Giuliani. But it was
now interestingly, the studio was sort of on the edge of Hell's Kitchen, so it wasn't really in the real down and dirty part. But it was just edgy enough to where you weren't sure what was going to happen if you walked out your door at night. You know?
Yeah. Again, it was on 53rd between 9th and 10th.
Right, closer to 10th Avenue, closer to the 10th Avenue. And it was right across the street from a public school. So there was a big playground. So there's kind of a lot of empty space around it.
Well, in a future episode, what I would like for us to do is, to discuss the fate of many of these iconic places, including studios and, clubs where we played during the 80s and 90s. This has been incredible. I hope all of you have enjoyed some of the trivia that we've been able to uncover during this podcast. And this just begs for a part 2, which we will put together for you in the days ahead. Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Again, I just want to mention, if you want to hear any of this music that I did with French Lick, you can go to rockstarpmk.com. I just started putting that stuff up there so you can hear some good old 80s rock.
Yeah, and I'll include a link in this video in the description for you, Patrick.
Super.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. It's always a pleasure. Love it.
All right. Take care.
Thanks, PK. Thanks.
Yep. Bye.